Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the second webinar of Access to Medicines Dialogues, the new EPHA series of online events on various access to medicines topics. We kicked off Access to Medicines Dialogues last week. Last Monday, we had our first webinar on how to achieve meaningful innovation via regulatory reform. And with our guest speakers, we presented to you a comprehensive, complete list and set of recommendations for regulatory reform. Today, we have our second webinar, and we're going to zoom in on one of the hottest topics in pharma, the question of IP, the question of intellectual property incentives. Today's title is the EU's IP strategy. Is it an enabler? Is it a barrier for patients' access? Is it a barrier or enabler for innovation? This is definitely not a new discussion, but it is indeed a recent debate, at least for Europe. It is a recent debate because I just want to remind you that it was only in June 2016 when health ministers signed off some pretty politically incorrect, very straightforward, groundbreaking Council conclusions, politically acknowledging that there is a series of imbalances in the pharmaceutical systems in Europe. They put on top of the agenda the topic of IP, an issue which until then, until 2016, was rather a taboo. Very few people, especially in Brussels, would dare to raise this issue in public and on the record. But the ministers themselves, in light of the pressure by the excessive prices of some medicines, put this issue on top of the political agenda. The groundbreaking Council conclusions of June 2016 triggered a series of processes and procedures which keep us busy until today. I will remind you, we've been a long way in a short period of time. We've had since then an overarching review, incentives review, conducted by the European Commission or mandated by the European Commission following the request of the health ministers, the introduction of an SVC manufacturing waiver in Europe, and more recently, over the summer, we saw the publication of the delayed publication of the long-awaited Commission staff working document with the evaluation of the orphans and pediatrics legislation in Europe. Next month, by end of November, we will have the publication of the pharmaceutical strategy, along with the presentation by the Commission of an IP action plan. And this is something that we will talk about extensively today. But oftentimes, we hear a lot about intellectual property, patent-based monopolies and exclusivities. And I wonder if if people understand what are the real-life implications of these, let's say, abstract concepts and terms. In fact, these perks and benefits, these privileges that the legislator in Europe and elsewhere generously grants to the pharmaceutical companies in order to incentivize research and development in certain areas can have very real-life implications for patients' access to medicines, for the competition landscape, but also for the quality of innovation per se. So today, it's my pleasure. I'm joined here today by our exquisite guests. We have Tira de Jong. Tira is one of the leading authors. Hi, Tira. Welcome, and it's great to have you here. One of the leading authors of the study that the Commission asked for on the evaluation of the orphans and pediatrics legislation. Tira de Jong, she's with the Technopolis group, this group that actually conducted the research on behalf of the European Commission. We also have Dimitri and Nikel with us from the policy advisor from the MSF Access campaign here in Brussels. Hi, Dimitri. Sergio Napolitano, General Counsel and Director of External Relations of Medicines for Europe, the Trade and the Trade Association for Generics and Biosimilar Medicines in Brussels. And on the phone, we have with us Alfonso Calles from the European Commission, DG Growth. Today, we're going to look at how do we best align these incentives with the objectives that we identified in the legislation. How do we make sure, we will ask ourselves if these are the right incentives and this is the best way to achieve the goals that we've set. We will also look at how do we build this bridge and how do we get the balance right? How do we strike the balance right between protection and access and affordability? So with this, I would like to, first of all, clarify some housekeeping rules. You should be able, based on the choice you have on your Zoom webinar settings, you should be able to see us, all speakers, at all times on your screen. The session is recorded. And of course, please feel free to engage on Twitter using hashtag A2M Dialogues. You can also see on our social media, we've been sharing also the Twitter handles of our guest speakers today. And the session is recorded. I don't remember if I said that, but yes, it is. So let's begin with Alfonso. Alfonso, I don't know if you can hear us. Can you hear us?
I can. Thank you.
Wonderful. It would be great if you could explain to our audience what is driving the Commission in publishing this IP action plan next month.
Yes, I mean, we aim to adopt an intellectual property action plan by the end of hopefully next month. It will be done alongside of the pharmaceutical strategy. And the objective that we have is mainly that the EU innovators have access to fast, effective, and affordable protection tools. I mean, we would like to tackle further initiatives to overcome remaining fragmentation. For example, we know that the patent system, the also geographical indications, and other IP remain with some degree of fragmentation in the European Union. So we want to see this. I mean, we have been observing also the evolution of IP during the pandemic. I mean, the COVID crisis that we are witnessing. So we will also try to draw lessons learned during this crisis. So I think this is the main drivers of the IP action plan. It will have a specific, hopefully, it will have some specific aspects related to pharmaceutical incentives, and also this will go in hand with the pharmaceutical strategy that will look also into the issue of innovation in the pharmaceutical sector. Probably we expect on the area of unmet medical needs. So I think it will be complementary to the pharmaceutical strategy.
Thank you, Alfonso.
Also, just to finish, we will also, of course, probably have a look to the issue of counterfeiting and piracy that also has to do with the pharmaceutical sector.
Yes, we will come back. We will see in detail which topics you will be covering. But I want to go now to Dimitri. Dimitri, you at MSF, you're of the view that IP protection, different ways and forms of IP protection, actually is not conducive to innovation. But how do you elaborate? Can you elaborate on that? What is your view on that? And what is your experience also from the field?
Sure, thank you. I think indeed it's indeed the case that intellectual property rights is not always conducive or can actually be a barrier for innovation as well. There is already academic research that shows, including by the US Bureau for Economic Research, so quite a well-known institute actually, that shows that longer and stronger monopolies, such as that are granted in intellectual property rights, are actually not helping innovation. And in a way that's logical if you think about it. If we're talking about an innovative, competitive sector, you know, what drives you to stimulate you to innovate is the risk of somebody else coming along with a better product. That's what stimulates your innovation. If you prolong those protections or make them even stronger, that risk reduces, so you're actually less inclined to innovate. So that's one aspect which is purely economical. And on the other hand, we have our own experience that we documented with Médecins Sans Frontières in a report that we published in 2016, A Fair Shot for Vaccine Affordability. And it actually details very specifically how numerous patents are granted on various aspects of vaccines. The ingredients, the vectors, the adjuvants, the DNA and RNA sequences, the processes, how to manufacture them, etc. They're all patented separately and held by different patent holders. And that creates a difficulty for new innovators and competitors to enter the market because it creates legal uncertainty. It increases the cost. it becomes more difficult to enter that market, and that actually restrains them from entering the market with a new product, because it's not clear if they can actually succeed in offering their product on the market. And that becomes very clear now as well with COVID-19. Currently, there are 2 patent issues for COVID-19 vaccines, one by Inovio, with a manufacturer that holds the technology, that has the patent on the technology on how to produce the vaccine that Inovio is developing, and they can't agree. And that this is delaying the production schedule on how to bring that product on the market. And another one is between Moderna and Arbutus, which is a Canadian-based biotech company. So there as well, we see that currently the development of COVID-19 vaccines that we're all waiting for is being delayed, because knowledge, essential technology, is owned by different owners who have competitive interests, and that is actually creating a barrier in moving forward in the innovation that we would need.
Alfonso, if I may ask, I want to get back to you. Dimitri just presented some of the evidence in his view, which back their case. What is the evidence that the Commission has to rely, or to rely itself on, to say that actually IP is conducive to innovation?
Well, I think that this discussion is a little bit philosophical. I mean, yes, of course, you need competition, and competition makes others to come with alternative treatments. But if in the first place you don't have some certainty that you are going to recover the investments of innovation, why are you going to, in the first place, to invest in innovation? I mean. Developing a medicine, it takes many years. It can take more than 10 years, and very few that the medicines that you start developing, then they are launched to the market, and not all of them, they have a financial viability. So if you don't have some certainty that you can, through, in this case, an exclusivity, you don't have, for a limited exclusivity, you don't have, you cannot recover that investment, why are you going to invest in the first place? And then patents allow competition, allow all this competition, because when you get a patent on a medicine, it doesn't prevent other companies from developing an alternative medicine and commercialize that alternative medicine. What the patent prevents is just that someone copy your exact medicine. But if you develop an alternative medicine, you are welcome to the market, and the patent cannot prevent that to entry. So I don't understand very well this. I mean, if we look at the countries that are good on pharmaceutical innovation, they all have an IP system as a prominent part of the toolkit that allow for innovation. I mean, I don't know any country that is good on pharmaceutical innovation who does not have an IP system in place.
And Alfonso, if I may, on the question of affordability and the pressure we've seen and we see in Europe in recent years, how do you take that into account, and how high is it on your priority list?
Yes, affordability, accessibility are part of the Commission angle when we look into the health sector, along with innovation. Of course, these are aspects to take into account in the health system, and it is something that we expect that will be tackled in the pharmaceutical strategy.
Mm-hmm. Sergio, over to you. 1 second, Dimitri, and we'll come back to that. In your opinion, Sergio, from Medicines for Europe, I guess you, from your sector, you see that at the end of the day, you need to foot most of the bill when it comes to expenditure cuts that we've seen, especially in the austerity years, in recent years in Europe. And at the same time, you hear that the way forward for innovation is to make sure that we have lengthy and solid forms of patent protection. What are your views on that?
So thanks, Yannis. I don't think that a solid patent protection is a problem per se, and actually Medicines for Europe welcomes very much the IP strategy and the action plan, because that means that the Commission and the institutions are focusing on a well-functioning IP system to stimulate innovation, which is fair enough. But also that means that the Commission is focusing on fine-tuning the system and fix issues that may become a barrier. One of those was the SPC manufacturing waiver that you mentioned. We will have to see the impact of that, but it's already a good step forward in terms of fine-tuning the SPC system. And we submitted a very detailed contribution to the IP action plan, just to highlight those issues that can be a real obstacle for generic entry, and as a consequence, access, affordability, and so on. Just to mention the main one, which is a systemic issue, is the one related to patent quality, as well as the accountability of the granting bodies of these patents. Patent quality, raising patent quality versus quantity is fundamental for us, because that is conducive to a solid IP system, which I think is in the interest of everyone, but also of a credible IP system, and also avoiding that the procedures in the granting phase of patents are abused, like is the case for divisional patents, but we can discuss this later. The other point I think very important, and then I stop and then I can go into the details later, is fragmentation, which is something that Alfonso mentioned, where I think there are several aspects that may be fine-tuned to make the IP system an enabler rather than an obstacle.
You talked about more quality over quantity. I guess it's something for the European Patent Office to take into account. What would you like to see changing there?
Yeah, so I think the European Patent Office is making a lot of efforts to increase efficiency, which is a good thing in principle. Efficiency, however, doesn't mean necessarily granting as many patents as possible. I think that efficiency of a granting body means also that this granting body should take account of the developments, even in court, of those patents, those titles that they grant, and then adjust their practice to make sure that this is not abused, for instance. So I think, and this goes back to the other point that I was mentioning, accountability is fundamental, because the EPO is actually providing private rights which have a very, very big impact on the public. So I think that accountability from public institutions very transparently is fundamental in Europe.
Thank you for this. And this is something that we don't really hear much about. So it's interesting that you bring it up at the start of our discussion. Tira, over to you. So you are one of the few experts in Europe who have a very good idea, because that's what you had to work on in order to develop a very detailed study for the European Commission, looking at one of the very sensitive and important areas, the area of orphan drugs. Your study, the Technopolis Group study, was published alongside the Commission staff working document in late July this year, early August this year. What were your main findings?
First of all, Janus, I think you're giving me a little too much credit here, because my role as a policy consultant is to borrow the expertise of others and to synthesize that. So I'm by no means the sole expert on this. So the background to this evaluation was essentially that after, at the time, 17 years, we're now, as was mentioned in the introduction, a bit delayed. So we're now 20 years on to get an understanding of what has this regulation actually yielded so far. How does that compare to what it had set out to do? But also provide some insights into whether there are potential inefficiencies in the system with an eye towards future-proofing the legislation. So what we found is, and I think for people who work in the field, a lot of it, what we found is not necessarily so surprising, but it puts evidence to some of the sentiments that are already out there, is a combination of some very positive innovation impacts. What you see is that the field for R&D in the space of rare diseases has taken flight in that period of time. And you can definitely credit that to a degree to the orphan regulations. Some credit also goes to other regulations in jurisdictions such as the US and Japan, as well as to scientific advances. So where we stand today is very different from where we stood 20 years ago, with a lot more products in the pipeline that stand to benefit patients of rare diseases. At the time we did our assessment, we had 140 products on the market. I just checked the EMA website today. We are now at 182 authorized orphan medicines. So there's a lot of positive impacts there. At the same time, I think what our evaluation also shows is that not necessarily all of those efforts have been directed into the areas where it's most needed, and that you even see a diminishing rate of return in there. We now see clustering in areas where you can say the market dynamics have changed such that you can question whether specific incentives are still required.
So essentially here on this point, you mean that the non-orphan market, or rather the orphan market starts to resemble more and more the non-orphan market?
In some areas, not necessarily across the board. I mean, there are still diseases for which you see hardly any activity, and where sponsors, as the terminology of the orphan regulation calls the developers, would really struggle to actually make any sort of significant return on investment on their products. Having said that, there are definitely subsections of the market where the market for rare diseases is as profitable, potentially even more so, than for non-orphan products.
Sergio, is this an issue that concerns your sector or not?
This is an issue that concerns our sector in general. So we are, again, supportive of the orphan incentive system. However, we have seen in the last few years some, let's say, misuse, I would say. I wouldn't say abuse, but I would say misuse of the system that do not go necessarily into the direction of the intentions of the legislation. I'm speaking about, for instance, the accumulation of overlapping periods of exclusivity, basically different products, but to treat the same disease that were overlapping, postponing basically the actual competition from the generics, or the cases in which orphan exclusivities have been used together with pediatric exclusivities and extensions to extend the monopoly as much as possible, which has been done in line with the legislation, because the legislation has allowed these kind of behaviors, and this is what we believe should be fine-tuned. At the same time, this is relevant for us because we want to find a space in the orphan sector, so in the orphan field, and we feel there is a lack of incentive for competition in the follow-on orphan field. So incentivizing generic and biosimilar medicines for orphan products, we believe, is fundamental. Where we find many difficulties, if not also due to the fact that there is a very little population to be treated, and it's complicated, for instance, for a biosimilar to find patients for clinical trials. The other issue is how to stimulate investments in the pediatric field for the off-patent sector, which is a system that in Europe has not worked, or to a very limited extent, and where we see the need for additional incentives for our sector.
Alfonso, if you hear us, and then over to Dimitri to comment on this. The orphans evaluation and the orphans and pediatrics evaluation is carried out by DG Santé, if I'm not mistaken. And I wonder to what extent these issues will be covered or mentioned in the IP action plan, or if they fall under the remit of this at all. Because the problem we see with orphan drugs, obviously, the legislation has given us, as Tira explained, some very important innovation, but at the same time, what we see today, now that we have the experience, is that a lot of these products, 5 years later, they are not even in half of the markets in the EU, or 5 and 7 years later, there are no generics, still no generics and no biosimilars. So there is a serious concern over, obviously, the affordability, the extension of these exclusivities and the different forms of patent protection, resulting in patients not being able to enjoy the fruit of this regulation.
Well, I mean, the evaluation was concluded, and now the pharmaceutical strategy will most probably elaborate, explain further which are the next steps in that area. So it will be basically in the remits of DG Santé to develop, to improve the orphan and pediatric system. Of course, we in DG Grow, we will try to support and see also with them potential incentives in this area. Mm-hmm.
And is it something, I mean, I don't know if you know, but I guess because of the intra-service consultation, if you could enlighten us a bit on the next steps, I guess by the end of the year or not, we will see an inception study, an impact assessment. What are the next steps?
Well, I mean, if something has to be done in the area of orphan and pediatrics, which I guess something will be done, they will have to conduct an impact assessment. An impact assessment is an exercise that requires a lot of research and consultations, etc. So for sure, it's not something that is done in a matter of weeks or months. So I guess it will be a work for sure. I imagine most of the next year. I mean, the process is that if after an evaluation, if you identify some areas, some shortcomings, areas where you can improve something, then you can say, okay, I will try to see if I can improve this aspect. So for this, you produce the Commission services produce an impact assessment where the problems and the drivers of these problems are analyzed. This stem from the previous evaluation that is already published. Then we see these problems, the drivers that cause the problem. We can see options to overcome those problems, to improve the situation. We try to quantify the impact of those options on these areas that we were discussing, on innovation, impact on affordability, accessibility, pricing, etc. And based on all these criteria and the impact on the different stakeholders, we choose which are the preferred options. And then these options can be legislative or non-legislative actions. If one of the preferred option or the retained option is legislative, that could mean that the pediatric and orphan legislation has to be changed, and for that the Commission services would draft a proposal of amendments of the existing regulation based on this impact assessment, and then that is approved and then that is sent to the Council and the European Parliament for amendments and adoption of the final legislation. So this is a process that can easily take I don't know, just to say something, 2 years at least. Yeah. But so I would say that if something is going to be done, an impact assessment would be for next year, and start working on an amendment or legislative amendment. If that would be the conclusion of the impact assessment, that would be probably the starting point would be for sure second half of the next year. End of next year, and then 2002 for drafting the proposal of new regulation and adoption by the Commission. So I would say that 1 year and a half at least would be necessary to make a Commission proposal. This is my guess. I mean, also this type of legislation is complex and they normally have impact on the stakeholders, so it has to be carefully crafted.
Thank you, Alfonso. Very, very clear. We understand it's going to be a long journey. I don't think that anyone expected this to be an overnight shift. Dimitri, thank you for your patience. You wanted to comment. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I want to build up on something that both Alfonso mentioned and to what Sergio referred to, and that's indeed patent quality, because it's not so much about a philosophical discussion. It's about how do we improve the policies so that they receive the best outcomes. And of course, we all want to have better innovation, and and we want to make sure that prices remain acceptable and affordable. And for this, we will need at some point generic competitions to push prices down. That's a well-known fact that we need this generic competition to take place to push prices down to keep, our medicines affordable within our healthcare budget. And so the issue is how is the IP system used? And that's where the issue that Sergio mentions of patent quality really is important. The human papilloma virus, there's a vaccine for that, and there's a patent on it granted by the EPO, human papilloma virus vaccine for under 14-year-olds. Just a very broad claim of that patent that has been granted, and this basically blocks any other vaccine developer from developing a vaccine and putting it on the market for under 14-year-olds, which is exactly the population we need to reach to vaccinate against this virus. So it's the broad claim as well as unmerited patents, which are particularly problematic. We have filed an opposition on the sofosbuvir metabolite patent at the European Patent Office because we analyzed the patent and it turns out it's scientifically incorrect. The molecule that is described in there cannot enter a liver cell. Because of biochemical reasons, it cannot enter a liver cell, so it cannot function what is described in the patent. And what is more, and this is where the issue of innovation comes in, it describes a molecule that is produced by the body after you take the pill. So if you patent this biochemical reaction in your body, it blocks everybody else to invent the medicine from creating the same reaction in your body. So it's not the medicine that is patented here, it's an element that is produced by your body, and it blocks innovators from producing, for example, a different treatment that is maybe less toxic or better, that you can support better, that doesn't give you any headaches, etc., but that would have the same effect. And this is where the balance between innovation or the issue of innovation very much relates to how patents are granted and under what conditions. And patent quality, I completely agree with Sergio. We need to address this at the EPO because we do see patents which are either too broad or which have incorrect claims, and that's not really acceptable.
And to what extent, Sergio, to what extent do you see this being realistic politically speaking, or what should the next steps be in order to bring this issue forward?
So I don't think this is realistic. I don't know if it is realistic or not. I hope so. I think it has to be realistic, and there needs to be an effort on the part of all the parties to improve the IP system in terms of quality. Otherwise, again, the credibility of the whole system falls, and it's not in the interest of anyone. So I think Dimitri, without entering into the details of the cases he mentioned, I think raises an issue that follows from what he says, which is the fact that on patents, there may be many discussions on whether patents are valid or not. And that's why there is a lot of litigation at all levels, in all member states, on all kinds of products. I think there is one point, because Yanis, you spoke about real life implications of the IP system. There is one issue that follows from what Dimitri was mentioning, which is the patent linkage issue. Mm-hmm. Patent linkage, probably everyone knows, is that practice that conditions administrative or regulatory decisions to the existence of a patent. So that's where the complication comes from. Patents are valid until they are valid, and they become invalid when courts invalidate them. So that's why the Commission considers patent linkage unlawful in Europe. And that's why the Commission committed in its pharmaceutical strategy sector inquiry to act against patent linkage. Exactly because the fact that you base a marketing authorization of a generic or a pricing and reimbursement of a generic or a tender bid of a generic to the fact that there is a patent is very open to misuse, or at least to anti-competitive effects. If you consider that on paracetamol, there are still many patents, on aspirin, there are many patents. So of course, and it's legitimate, there have to be patents if there is some sort of innovation, but this doesn't mean that competition cannot enter. That's why we hope, and we stressed this over the last few years, and we stressed it in our contribution to the Commission, we need to see a clear ban of patent linkage in the legislation.
So this is a very clear ask. I want to go a bit to the issue of orphan drugs. We have a question also from the audience for you, Sergio. Do we have generics in the field of orphans? in the market? How do we know if many companies, I said that we don't see even 5, and after 7 or 8 years, we still don't see generics in the market. Could you please clarify whether these markets actually have an added value for you or not? And then over to Tira to dig a bit into further into the question of the current system.
So they do have an added value, and I thank Boris for this question because that helps me stress what I was mentioning. So we need incentives for investments in generics and biosimilars for orphan products. We know that in the future, public expenditure will mainly be on these kind of products. Tira was mentioning the numbers, which are very high. And so we need to have competition in those fields in the future. And that's why we are asking for very concrete regulatory incentives to support of patent development, like tailoring clinical requirements, like single development for lawn orphans, like reduced timelines of fast track for pricing and reimbursement decisions, and this kind of thing. So there is a clear interest in entering that space. There are for certain products, obviously generics or biosimilars, but we see a lot of obstacles. And I think that if we want to, again, fine tune the system or fix the system, this is the right moment to do it, to create more competition.
Tira, you want to add something on this, and then I can ask you a bit more on other aspects of orphan drugs.
I mean, I can put a few numbers to that. Keep in mind, our data by now are almost 3 years old because of the time lag in everything. But in the list of medicines that we looked at, so it's not the full set of OMPs that was at the market at the time, but a very large share of that. Only 16 of those were no longer protected by either a market exclusivity or a patent or an SPC. So the vast majority of the products at the time, there couldn't be any generic or biosimilar competition. What we did look at is for the ones that are completely free of protection, which were only 9, did we see any generic entry? And the truth there is that in less than half of the cases was there generic entry so far. So that's 4 products in the mix where there's generic entry. For some of them, you actually do see significant generic entry. Famous example, even though it's not an orphan medicine in Europe anymore, Gleevec, there are multiple generic versions of imatinib on the market today. But the issue there is, why is that not happening? Why are we not seeing any of that generic competition? And I think there's a few causes of which the market exclusivity really is only one, because as I said, even after all of these protections expire, we still don't see that market come to life. Why is that? Well, partly that is inherent to the fact that they're rare diseases, so it is a small market, and it will be difficult for any second party to come into that market and gain significant market share. What we've also shown in our data is that a significant number of orphan medicines and a growing number are either biological molecules or advanced therapy medicinal products. And for those 2 types of products, generic entry, or in this case, biosimilar entry, will be far more complex than it is for the small molecules. So it is very limited, the extent of competition coming into the market. And in short term, that's not going to change, and the market exclusivity is only part of the problem.
Tira, you looked at the how the legislation, the regulation, the orphan drugs regulation has worked until now. The legislator foresaw some breaks, some let's say public safeguards, correct? If I'm not mistaken, in Article 8. Have those safeguards, first of all, why did the legislator think of those safeguards in the first place? Have they been used? If not, why? And should they be practically replaced by something else more user-friendly, if we may describe it this way?
Sure. Well, in a way, if you think of it, it wasn't necessarily intended to be there per se as a safeguard. The whole reason that the orphan regulation was created was on the assumption that the reason we weren't having these medicines out there was for lack of commercial interest in the space. So the idea was to provide incentives to products where that lack of return on investment was likely to be a barrier. So you could say that we only grant these exclusivities or these incentives to products where we can demonstrate that lack of return on investment is what's blocking their development. Now, in practice, that turned out to be not very workable. They tried the same in the US very briefly, abandoned that effort after just a couple of months. So the idea of basing this on the prevalence of a disease is actually a proxy measure.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that is the route that has always been taken. The regulation still allows any sponsor to file an application for an orphan designation, not on the basis of prevalence, but on the basis of expected lack of return on investment. Has that ever been done? Only once, and that application was withdrawn. So it's not really used, that route. So in that sense, the safeguard also doesn't help. You can only trigger the safeguard on the basis of the designation.
And if I may ask you, why haven't companies used that route? Why do they go for the prevalence one? What did you find?
Well, the standard answer to that, and I think people in industry are probably better placed to answer that from their own perspective than I am, but we've asked this question to the companies, and the idea there a lot of the time is that when you start an innovation at the early stages of your development, you may not necessarily know either what your patient population is that you're going to be targeting with that. You don't necessarily know the cost of your development, so you cannot estimate properly your return on investment at an early stage of your development. And if you want to demonstrate potential return on investment, you lack the parameters basically to do that. But do you buy that argument? Because to me it sounds that if companies wanted to use this route, then there would have to be transparency on something where we don't have transparency. The question of the R&D cost, the manufacturing cost, and how would we define the sufficiently profitable element if we don't know these basic elements? I buy the argument as far as that. It's for me to really to judge on that, but yes, I do think that it's a valid argument in the beginning stages of any type of innovation. It will be very difficult to estimate your return on investment properly early on. Having said that, of course, there's always a way to invert the system and say, okay, we take that uncertainty in there, we grant an orphan designation on the basis of prevalence, we work with that, and for instance, after 5 years, 6 years, that's when you need to open your books and show us whether or not you still require protection for an additional period of time, which in a way is triggering that safeguard, but opening up that door on a different set of criteria. And would that be something that would make you happy, in the sense that you think it would restore the balance or will increase the balance in the system? Well, or something else, or something else. If it's something else. Of the overcompensation that we've tried to calculate is only off in a small percentage of cases. I mean, 14% is the number that we came up with. That number is surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. So you can argue definitely that there should either be more or less. So changing the entire regulation on the basis of a minority of cases brings definite risks with it. And on top of that, it will be a difficult solution to trigger, because it means that somebody will need to actually go in and trigger, not just trigger that clause, but needs to actually do the assessment of the financial data in there. The question is, who would that be? Because the EMA, which is currently in charge of assessing the orphan designations, doesn't have the in-house capacity to do that. Dimitri, there's also a question for you. You can already answer. You share your thoughts, but I would like also to raise a question. If you have an alternative system that you could elaborate on if we were to, let's say, replace or improve the IP system, what would your thoughts be, and in which direction? What would your wish list be?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm not saying here that overnight we suddenly have to switch from one system to the other, but gradually we have to improve the system as we move forward. And there's a lot of money that is currently being invested in the purchase of vaccine. I think it's about 230 billion euro in Europe at the moment that is being that's kind of the yearly expenses for medicinal products in Europe at the moment. And if we would, there's a lot of expectation from extending exclusivities, monopolies, to improve research and development efforts. But if we would decrease our spending on the purchase of those medicines, about 75% of that 230 billion is currently going to originate the products. So if we would decrease the expenses by having more generic competition and less reliance on exclusivity and used that money to support research and development earlier on, I think we would have an increase in terms of better health outcomes, better aligned with research and development priorities, etc. Because we're just expecting the market to take care of this, but we can also steer by steering the financial flow of the money that we spend anyway on purchasing products in terms of better aligning it with the research and development priorities that we would like. But there's an other element that I wanted to touch upon, which was mentioned by Tira, which is related to that we don't know what the R&D costs are. And that's particularly of interest also with regards to the supplementary protection certificate system, because that system actually allows a patent holder to extend its patent term for a number of years beyond the basic patent term of 20 years. And the main reason that it was introduced was an assumption that the time, the patent term that companies had was decreasing because of development time and market approval time. And so the effective time that they had was too short to recoup research and development investments that they had. Now, we did some research from our side, me and a few other authors in a peer-reviewed publication. And I would like to show a brief slide, because I think it's really important that we look at what is really at stake. Supplementary protection certificates in 2016, the Council conclusion, the Council of Europe, the Council asked for an analysis of the impact of the supplementary protection certificate on access to medicines. And the European Commission has done a number of interesting reports on the economic impact of supplementary protection certificates, but hasn't really addressed or haven't really provided insight or analysis on the impact of access to medicines, which is a key issue, of course. And so we did a study on 3 specific medicines, sofosbuvir for hepatitis C and imatinib and trastuzumab for cancer. And we looked at the investment that companies did. This is based on public information that we could find, to either the investment in research and development or to acquire a kind of the product and bring it to the market. And so those numbers are on the top level. That's the first line. In 2013, they brought the product on, or the second line is the year they brought the product on the line. So 2013, 2001, 1999. And we looked then at the sales revenue that was created for this product for those companies. And within 3 years, for all the 3 products, the sales revenue surpassed that initial investment. And after that, they had 10 more years of basic patent terms. So the patent that were granted by the European Patent Office lasted for more than 10 years, up to 13 years after the point that they surpassed the investment. And then on top of that, they were receiving months or years of additional exclusivity under the assumption that the patent term was not sufficient to recoup the investment. I know there's a lot of questions about incentivizing research and development as well, or relocating research and development to Europe in relation to SPC. But on that point, the evidence that has been published by different authors, including by Technopolis, etc., that evidence base is weak or very questionable. It's not clear. There's no clear signal or sign that really supplementary protection certificates incentivize research and development. On the other hand, they do have an impact on access to medicines. We also investigated, and it's not on the slide, the access to Truvada in 12 countries. And we could clearly indicate where SPCs were not granted by European member states, there the prices went down, generic versions became available, and they were reimbursed. But in countries where the SPC was maintained, which was happening because of specific legal reasons, in certain members it was granted and maintained, there the prices were 400 to more than €1,000 for a month's supply, and there was no reimbursement. And so we have to think about, there are very few people in Europe, I think, that can afford 400 to €1,000 a month buying these medicines from out-of-pocket expenses. So clearly there's a link here between where those products were granted an SPC, they were not affordable and available for the people, and where the SPC was not granted, it was not affordable and not available for the people. So I invite really people who are interested in access to medicines to have a close look at this paper, because it's a really important issue that the European Commission will review going forward. So let's have a real discussion about the impact on access to medicines as was requested by the Council, and look from the public health perspective rather than only from the economic side.
Before I go to Alfonso, I would also like to get Sergio's views on the SPC regulation. What would you like to see from now onwards from the Commission? What would be your priority list? And then we can go to Alfonso to hear from him.
Thanks, Yannis. So I think it's going to be interesting what the Commission's assessment will be of the SPC. So we have contributed from a technical point of view, both to a legal analysis, which was done by the Max Planck Institute, which resulted in a huge report, very interesting report, showing that the SPC system, despite in the intentions, was supposed to be a very simple system of extension of patents, in the end resulted in being a chaos. And the other one was the economic analysis that was done by the Copenhagen Economic Institute. So I think it's going to be interesting what the assessment of the Commission will be, in my understanding, but I think Alfonso can confirm that the Commission will also publish that assessment soon. I think there is another aspect in relation to the SPC, which is the unitary SPC. So in case the unified patent court, unified patent system will be introduced in Europe, there will be a need for a unitary SPC. I think there is a potential access issue, which is in relation to the fact that today you have registration of SPCs not in all European countries, but in, according to the Commission, 20 out of 28 member states or something like that. So there is on average 8 out of 28 member states where SPCs are not registered. And with a unitary SPC, you would have an automatic coverage of the whole European territory of an SPC. And the risk in relation to access there is that you end up having an SPC protection everywhere, also in those small countries where very often SPCs are not registered. And these SPCs are not registered because the innovative products are not even launched in those countries. And this is the trick. So the paradox might be that you have a protection in that country, but you cannot have a generic or a biosimilar in that country, which is what happens today. So I think this has to be taken into account, together with obviously ensuring the highest level of transparency of procedures, including the possibility for third-party observations and oppositions in the system. And again, to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the need for accountability for the granting body of these unitary SPCs.
Alfonso, I don't know if you want to comment on the points, the concerns or the fears, let's say, that Sergio just expressed on the unitary SPC. And then I would like to, as we have 10 minutes left, I would like to ask you what are the battlegrounds that you know best, what's in the IP action plan, what are the battlegrounds that you foresee?
Well, on the SPC, the Supplementary Protection Certificate, we are also finalizing the evaluation of this SPC legislation. Hopefully, it will be published also together with the IP action plan in some weeks. Yeah, there we analyze if the SPC has been effective and efficiency in terms of in relation to its objectives, no? If it has an impact on innovation, for example, if it is working well, the system. And of course, if we, after this evaluation, we decide to improve the SPC system, we will have to follow the process that I described before. We would need an impact assessment that would be done next year. And then in this impact assessment, we will analyze the potential problems, solutions, options, and there we will have to take into account aspects like the ones that Sergio raised, no, like accessibility, etc. Also, in the evaluation of the SPC system, we look into the issues not only of innovation but also its impact on access and affordability. I mean, in the previous years, we worked on some improvements of the SPC system to improve access to medicines with the SPC manufacturing waiver, to try to improve the let's say the ecosystem for generics and biosimilars to invest in Europe. with the SPC manufacturing waiver. So yes, we are taking into account all these aspects also of affordability and accessibility, as you can see.
But Alfonso, you mentioned also the SPC manufacturing waiver, and we saw in the recent past, apparently there was this war between big pharma and the generics side. But is now DG Growth trying to send a positive signal to EPHA and to big pharma via this IP action plan?
No, I mean, whatever we do, we see the impact in all stakeholders. I think, for example, working on improvements of the procedural aspects of the SPC system I think it will be positive for all the stakeholders that are affected by the SPC system.
Can I briefly react to the point of the manufacturing waiver? Because I really recall literally that the European Commission representative in the Parliament, based on questions on access to medicines in relation to SPC, says this is not a discussion about access to medicines. This is about the competitiveness of the generic sector on the global level. And this is why we introduced this waiver. It hasn't substantially changed the SPC system in Europe. There has been some tweaks to that benefit generic competition a little bit, but it hasn't really. We didn't have a proper discussion about, is this really a system that we need from a public health perspective? Is this really helpful for patients and healthcare system? In our view, it's a very costly system that doesn't provide much benefits. There's no substantial benefit that can be found from that system. And again, it's a peer-reviewed paper, so it's not just our opinion. So I would really like people who are working in healthcare systems in Europe to have a look at the paper and also ask the right fundamental questions of, do we want a system as it is currently designed?
And as coming to a close, I would say we can go on talking about these issues for a while. But Alfonso, a question for you: has the Commission really evaluated the cost of these exclusivities that we reward companies with? Do we have an idea, or we just take for granted that once these exclusivities are awarded to companies, then de facto we have a positive sum out of it?
Well, I mean, we can make calculations, and the evaluations always have a cost-benefit analysis where there are calculations on the impact. But in the area of IPR, of intellectual property rights in general, not only the SPC, sometimes it's difficult to calculate the exact contribution to, for example, innovation or creativity. I mean, to calculate which is the contribution of the trademark Coca-Cola to the sales of the Coca-Cola company, it is difficult. But I think there is a general understanding that the trademark system benefits the companies in their commercial activities, and as copyright can help authors for the creativity. So it is difficult to quantify the exact contribution, but yes, I mean, in the SPC evaluation, we have tried to make some calculations on what the SPC means in terms of additional cost for the health system, etc.
And Alfonso, last question to you, and then we go to concluding remarks by our speakers. I want to hear from you just in a nutshell, what would you like to see from this IP action plan next month, which will be announced by the Commission next month? Alfonso, will you do? Is it part of the mandate and the remit of the IP action plan to also talk about and look into the question of antibiotics and links with the SPC? Now, since we're looking at a new recalibration, if you wish, of the system, how does it seem? Perhaps a trade-off between orphans so that we can incentivize more products in the direction of AMR or not? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that the pharmaceutical strategy will discuss, and it is something I think that the Commission will look in the coming coming years, no? Because I think it's a major challenge and also an unmet medical need or unmet medical area. So specific on on the SPC, I mean, as the SPC system is now, it can do little for antibiotics because there is a market failure there. No, it's not that by giving extra exclusivity to an antibiotic you are going to invest more money there because the specific market of antibiotics. So, but okay, it is an area where I think that the European Commission, especially DG Santé, is going to look into during the coming years.
Thank you, Alfonso.
Let's be more positive within the coming months.
I see. I understand. Would you like to add anything else, or we can release you so that you don't have to be on your phone?
No, I'm fine. I'm listening. I'm taking notes of your comments.
Sergio, over to you. What, in a nutshell, the last concluding remarks, what would you like to see from this IP action plan?
So I think we mentioned already patent linkage. I think there is another, so the ban of patent linkage, the issue of quality, but there is another point that is, I think, relevant. It's in relation to a post-COVID situation. So there are many political discussion around an industrial policy to stimulate more investments in production in Europe, API in Europe, and so on. So I think the BOLAR exemption, which is what allows the API industry to develop and the generic industry to develop their product for regulatory purposes during the patent protection, that was introduced with a directive. The fragmented system led to a very gray area from a legal point of view, and the Commission in 2015 in their single market strategy stressed the need for harmonizing and enlarging the scope of the BOLAR in Europe. So I think that is very, very important because that would have a very strong impact on API development and production in Europe. The very last word, I think we are forgetting very often when we speak about IP, the competition angle. I think competition authorities are being more and more involved in discussions, as well as obviously in investigations on potential abuses. I think what is very important is that the Commission is working also on new competition tools to make sure that when there is a dominant company on the market and competition is about to come, they want to introduce tools to make sure that there is no potential behavior that would have anti-competitive effects. And at the same time, they want to introduce tools to also make recommendations to member states in terms of legislative actions if they see there are structural impediments to competition. So I think this is a very, very important aspect that has to go hand in hand with an IP strategy.
Thank you, Sergio. And Tira, over to you. Sergio referred to now the post-COVID-19 world, but we're still in the midst of the storm. But one thing is for sure that there is going to be pressure on the pharmaceutical budgets of EU member states in the coming months and probably years. And we're most likely going to go back to square one of the discussion around the access to medicines debate when the next expensive oncological product is on the market. What are your thoughts, having looked at the orphans, the field of orphan drugs for rare diseases? What do you foresee as the major, let's say, trends, or what would you like to see, as Alfonso said, be prioritized in a possible recalibration of the system?
Thanks, Jan. Well, for start, I think for me, in the role of policy consultant, it's really not up to me to formulate things, to have a wish list or recommendations in there. What I do is present the evidence and feed that to the people who actually need to make a decision on that. When the next big oncology product comes on the market with an orphan exclusivity tag, I think the issue that we described before is the market exclusivity is only one part of the picture in terms of what the protections are and what impact that has on generic competition. So it's much more complicated than that. And also these very steep price tags, that is an issue in itself that the regulation cannot tackle. Right. So I think that discussion needs to be had on a different level than within the context of the IP strategy, at least in part.
Thank you, Tira. And over to you, Dimi, for some concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of, looking forward, patent quality has already been mentioned by Sergio. I completely agree with that, as well as curtailing evergreening, extending monopolies just for the sake for extending monopolies because it's very profitable. It doesn't really benefit innovation in any way. Secondly, I would say, ensure that we can use compulsory licensing in Europe. Data exclusivity and market exclusivity currently hamper the ability to use compulsory licensing, which is a public health safeguard, so that especially now we can, in COVID-19, it would hamper possibilities for governments to take care of their population and produce or allow generic producers to produce certain medicines that are either missing or unaffordable, and at least make sure that they reach the people that need them. And the third element I would say is really on the supplementary protection certificate system, where the unitary system, SPC system, is now already advanced without having a proper discussion on the feasibility of the system as well as the impact on access to medicines. And this is really the kind of angle that we would need to take, because if it's not for public health, then why do we need a system? So this is what I would like to propose and see moving forward in terms of main discussion points and action points.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you also to our viewers who joined us. I can't see all of the questions, but I understand there was quite some activity in the Q&A chat room, and I'm guessing also on Twitter. This is just the first, I would say, an introduction to a discussion which is going to keep us busy. Alfonso from the European Commission made it clear that this is only the start of a very long journey. For us, the next session of EPHA's Access to Medicines Dialogues is on November 19th, where we're going to look at debating with a venture capitalist, a representative of DNDi, El Storelle, and also Jack Scannell, who is quite well known in this field. We're going to look at the trends, the winners, the losers, and the outlook in the pharma world, for the pharma world in the post-COVID-19 world. Until then, thank you very much for joining us. And this is only the discussion. This is only the start of a dialogue which will foster also at EPHA. Thank you very much to our speakers for joining us. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.